Sometimes a man's greatest weakness becomes his greatest strength. Sometimes saving 3 helpless puppies costs you everything you thought you wanted, and leads you to everything you never knew you needed. Silas McCrae had been an outlaw for 30 years when he made the choice that changed his life. The Burnt Ridge Gang ordered him to drown 3 whimpering pups they found beside a burned wagon. He couldn't do it. That simple act of mercy got him kicked out of the only family he'd known. Left behind in the dust with nothing but the dogs and his conscience, Silas took shelter in an abandoned trading post. While searching for kindling, he found an old cigar box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside was a Confederate cipher and half of a railroad map. Soon, strangers started showing up in town, asking about the man with the dogs. The map led to Civil War gold worth $7 million today. But what dark secret made his gang really abandon him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The abandoned trading post sat like a weathered gravestone against the vast Montana sky, its timber walls bleached gray by decades of sun and wind. Silas McCrae had called it home for 3 weeks now, ever since Cole Brennan and the Burnt Ridge Gang had left him standing in the dust with nothing but his conscience and 3 terrified puppies. He'd built the place up in his mind as temporary shelter. But each morning, when he woke to the soft whimpering of the dogs curled against his chest, temporary felt more like providence. The trading post had been abandoned for the better part of a decade, its last owner presumably claimed by the harsh territory or driven off by the isolation. What remained was a solid structure with thick walls, a stone fireplace that drew well, and floorboards that creaked familiar warnings when anyone approached. The 3 puppies, he'd taken to calling them Scout. Ranger and Sentry, for their different temperaments, had grown considerably in their time together. Scout, the smallest and most curious, possessed an uncanny ability to find trouble in the most unlikely places. Ranger, broad-shouldered even as a pup, seemed born to protect, positioning himself between Silas and any perceived threat. Sentry, the quiet one with mismatched eyes, watched everything with an intelligence that sometimes unnerved even a man who'd spent 30 years reading dangerous situations. Silas had not intended to become attached to the animals. Attachment was a luxury an outlaw couldn't afford, a lesson he'd learned in blood and betrayal over 3 decades of hard living. Yet here he was, sharing his meager rations and finding comfort in their presence during the long, cold nights when memories of better times refused to stay buried. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very act of mercy that had cost him his place with the gang had given him something he'd never experienced with those hard men: unconditional loyalty. The dogs didn't care about his reputation, his past crimes, or the scars that mapped a lifetime of violence across his weathered hands. They cared only that he'd chosen to save them when others would have shown no mercy. 30 years. That's how long he'd ridden with various outlaw gangs, the last 15 with Cole Brennan's crew. He'd been young when it started, barely 18, and fresh from a failed attempt at honest living after the war between the states. The transition from Union cavalry scout to cattle rustler hadn't been difficult. Both required the same skills of reading terrain, tracking movement, and staying one step ahead of pursuit. But where the cavalry had demanded honor and duty, the outlaw life had gradually eroded those qualities until Silas barely recognized the idealistic young soldier he'd once been. Cole Brennan had found him in a saloon in Tombstone in 1873, down to his last silver dollar and nursing wounds both physical and spiritual. Cole had a way of seeing potential in broken men, and he'd offered Silas something he desperately needed: purpose, even if that purpose ran counter to everything he'd once believed. The Burnt Ridge Gang became his family, bound not by blood, but by shared danger and mutual dependence. They'd been good years, mostly. The gang operated with a code of sorts. They targeted wealthy ranchers and railroad barons, men whose losses wouldn't cost working families their livelihoods. They avoided unnecessary killing, split their earnings fairly, and looked after their own when times got lean. Silas had found a kind of peace in that life, a way to channel his military skills without the weight of serving a cause he'd grown to question. But peace built on violence is always temporary, and Silas had sensed changes in Cole over the past year. The younger members of the gang pushed for bigger scores, riskier jobs, and Cole seemed increasingly willing to listen. The old codes were becoming suggestions rather than rules, and Silas had watched good men make choices that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The incident with the puppies had been the breaking point, but it wasn't the beginning. It was simply the moment when 30 years of accumulated compromise collided with something pure and innocent that demanded protection rather than exploitation. Now, sitting in the trading post with late afternoon light filtering through cracked windows, Silas examined the contents of the cigar box for the 100th time. The wooden box itself was unremarkable. Cuban tobacco, the label faded beyond legibility. But what it contained had kept him awake for the better part of 3 nights. The Confederate cipher was written on official-looking paper in a neat, precise hand. The symbols and numbers meant nothing to him individually, but their arrangement suggested military precision. Alongside the cipher lay half of what appeared to be a railroad survey map, its edges deliberately torn rather than accidentally damaged. The remaining portion showed geographical features Silas recognized: Devil's Canyon, Widow's Peak, the serpentine course of Bitter Creek as it wound toward the territorial capital. What struck him most was the map's age. The paper had the yellow tinge of decades, and the ink had faded to a rusty brown that spoke of Civil War vintage. Someone had hidden this box with care, wrapping both documents in oiled cloth before sealing them away beneath the floorboards. The previous night, he'd made his first tentative trip into Dustwell, the nearest settlement, to gather supplies and information. The town was typical of frontier communities that had grown up around mining claims and cattle drives, a main street lined with practical businesses, a saloon that served as the social center, and a collection of modest homes occupied by people who'd chosen isolation over civilization for reasons of their own. What wasn't typical was the attention his presence had drawn. He'd counted at least 3 conversations that stopped when he entered the general store, and the storekeeper, a widow named Sarah Caldwell, had studied him with the kind of careful scrutiny usually reserved for dangerous men or federal marshals. Don't get many strangers this time of year, she'd said while tallying his purchases. Most folks with any sense head south before the heavy snows. I'm not most folks, Silas had replied, which earned him a smile that suggested she'd already reached that conclusion. The man staying at the old trading post, she'd continued, wrapping his supplies with practiced efficiency. Word is you've got yourself some dogs. Word travels fast in small towns, faster when strangers start asking questions about dog-owning drifters. That had gotten his attention. What kind of strangers? Sarah Caldwell had looked him directly in the eyes then, and he'd seen something there that reminded him of the officers who'd earned his respect during the war. Intelligence tempered by caution, strength wrapped in careful presentation, the kind that pay in gold coins for information, she'd said quietly. The kind that don't give their real names, but ask very specific questions about very specific things. The conversation had stayed with him through the cold ride back to the trading post, through the evening routine of feeding the dogs and banking the fire for the night. Someone was looking for him, or more precisely, someone was looking for a man with dogs in this particular area. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Now, with Scout curled across his boots and Ranger maintaining watch by the window, Silas considered his options. He could pack what little he owned and move on, the way he'd learned to do over 30 years of staying ahead of the law and enemies both. The territory was vast, and a man who knew how to live rough could disappear for years if he chose his route carefully. But something held him here beyond simple fatigue or the dog's comfort. Perhaps it was the certainty that running would only delay an inevitable confrontation. Perhaps it was curiosity about what secret had been buried beneath these floorboards and why it might be worth gold coins to the right person. Or perhaps, after 3 decades of running from one conflict to another, he was simply tired of being the man who always moved on when things became complicated. The war had taught him to read terrain and weather, to anticipate enemy movement and plan tactical responses. Those skills had served him well in the outlaw life, keeping him alive when younger, more reckless men had fallen to overconfidence or poor judgment. Now, those same instincts told him that whatever was coming would find him regardless of where he ran. Better to meet it here, on ground of his choosing, with time to prepare and clear fields of fire. The trading post had advantages: solid construction, multiple exit routes, good sight lines in all directions, and a water source that wouldn't freeze until deep winter. If trouble was coming, he could do worse than make his stand here. As if sensing his thoughts, Sentry lifted his mismatched eyes to meet Silas's gaze. The dog's expression held an almost human quality of understanding, as though he recognized that their simple days of hiding and healing were drawing to a close. "I know." "Boy," Silas murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. But running never solved anything permanent. Sometimes a man has to stop and turn around, face whatever's been chasing him. The cipher and map seemed to pulse with possibility in the dim light. Somewhere in those faded symbols and careful markings lay answers to questions he hadn't even known to ask. But answers came with a price, and Silas had learned long ago that the most valuable secrets were always the most dangerous to possess. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Winter was coming to this high country, and with it, the kind of isolation that could protect a man or trap him, depending on what he'd chosen to face before the snows made travel impossible. Silas folded the documents carefully and returned them to their oiled cloth wrapping. Tomorrow, he'd begin the work of understanding what he'd found. Tonight, he'd simply be grateful for a warm fire, loyal companions, and the first real peace he'd known in longer than he cared to remember. Sometimes, he reflected as Scout's breathing evened into sleep. The most important journeys began not when a man decided where he was going, but when he finally stopped running from where he'd been. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday morning when frost still glittered on the scrub grass and the dog's breath formed small clouds in the crisp air. Silas spotted him from a quarter-mile away, a lone rider approaching Dustwell from the east, sitting his horse with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to covering long distances. Something about the rider's posture, the way he surveyed the terrain as he approached, set off alarms in Silas's mind that 30 years of dangerous living had finely tuned. From his position on the ridge above the trading post, Silas watched through the field glasses he'd liberated from a cavalry patrol 15 years earlier. The stranger was well dressed by frontier standards, a dark coat that hadn't seen too much trail dust, boots that spoke of quality craftsmanship, and a hat that had been shaped by professional hands rather than weather and wear. Most telling was the way he rode directly to the general store rather than the saloon. Suggesting business rather than pleasure brought him to Dustwell. Silas made his way back to the trading post with the dogs ranging ahead, their behavior confirming his instincts. Scout's usual enthusiasm for morning exploration had given way to nervous energy, while Ranger positioned himself between Silas and the direction of town. Sentry, ever the sentinel, kept glancing back toward Dustwell as though expecting pursuit. "Easy, boys," Silas murmured, but his own tension betrayed his calming words. The animals sensed what he felt, the particular weight that settled in the air when long-buried secrets began stirring toward the surface. Inside the trading post, Silas pulled up the loose floorboard that had yielded the cigar box and felt around the remaining cavity. His fingers found what he'd missed in his initial excitement, a second, smaller bundle wrapped in what felt like canvas. This package contained a single sheet of paper folded multiple times and brittle with age. Unfolding it carefully revealed a wanted poster, the ink faded but still legible. The sketch showed a younger version of his own face, clean-shaven, and bearing the confident expression of a man who still believed in clear distinctions between right and wrong. Ezra Whitmore, the poster proclaimed in bold letters, wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of military supplies and desertion from the Union Army. Silas stared at the poster for a long moment, a name he hadn't used in over 20 years, bringing back memories he'd worked hard to bury. Ezra Whitmore had been the man he was before the war broke something essential inside him, before he'd learned that honor and duty could be twisted into tools of political convenience, before he'd walked away from everything he'd once believed sacred. The irony was sharp enough to cut. The poster was wrong on both counts. He'd never stolen military supplies, and he'd never technically deserted. But explaining the truth would have required revealing operations that officially didn't exist, missions that had been disavowed by commanders who sent men into situations too dark for public consumption. Easier to let Ezra Whitmore disappear and let Silas McCrae take his place in a world where past sins mattered less than present competence. But someone had kept this poster, hidden it away with documents that suggested its owner knew exactly who Ezra Whitmore had become. Someone had been expecting this moment for 20 years or more. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his brooding. Through the window, he watched the well-dressed stranger ride slowly up the path to the trading post, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. The man stopped 30 yards from the building and called out in a voice that carried the refined accent of Eastern education. "Mr. McCrae, I'd like to speak with you, if I may. I believe we have mutual interests to discuss." Silas positioned himself where he could see the stranger while maintaining cover. "State your business, mister." "I'm not receiving social calls." The stranger dismounted and stood beside his horse, hands visible and empty. "My name is Charles Whitman, and I represent certain parties with an interest in historical artifacts. I believe you may have recently come into possession of documents that would be of considerable value to my employers." "Don't know what you're talking about." "The Confederate cipher, Mr. McCrae, and the railroad survey map that accompanies it. I'm prepared to offer a substantial sum for their return to their rightful owners." The dogs had positioned themselves in a defensive triangle around the trading post, their low growls audible even through the walls. Silas felt a familiar clarity settle over him, the same crystalline focus that had kept him alive through countless firefights and dangerous raids. Someone had been tracking him, watching and waiting for him to find what they knew was hidden here. "How do you know what I might or might not have found?" Whitman smiled, and the expression held no warmth. "Because my employers helped hide those documents 23 years ago, Mr. McCrae. Or should I say, Mr. Whitmore. They've been waiting a very long time for the right person to retrieve them." The admission hit Silas like a physical blow. Not only did this stranger know about the documents, he knew about Ezra Whitmore, which meant whoever had sent him possessed information that could destroy the life Silas had built since the war. "You're going to have to be more specific about these employers of yours. Men who served the Confederacy with distinction. Men who understood that some treasures were too valuable to risk in the chaos of defeat. They entrusted certain items to loyal civilians for safekeeping, with the understanding that those items would one day be reclaimed. The war's been over for 20 years. Some wars never truly end. Mr. Whitmore, some loyalties transcend political convenience." Whitman's tone carried the fervor of true belief, the dangerous certainty of a man who'd spent decades nurturing old hatreds. "The cipher leads to a cache of gold that rightfully belongs to the sons and daughters of the Confederacy. Gold that could fund a resurgence of proper Southern values in this corrupted nation." Silas felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The documents weren't just historical curiosities. They were keys to a treasure that unreconstructed rebels had been guarding for decades. And somehow, through circumstances he still didn't understand, he'd become the unwitting guardian of their secrets. "Even if I had these documents you're talking about, what makes you think I'd hand them over to Confederate sympathizers?" Whitman's smile widened. Because you're Ezra Whitmore, Union deserter and thief. Because one telegram to the right federal marshal would see you spending your remaining years in territorial prison. Because the alternative to cooperation is the kind of unpleasantness that a man of your age should be eager to avoid. The threat was clear enough. But Silas heard something else in the man's tone, uncertainty masked by bluster. Whitman was operating from a position of incomplete knowledge, fishing for confirmation of what he suspected rather than stating what he knew for certain. You're assuming I care about federal threats. And my age in my profession doesn't accumulate much to lose. Perhaps not. But you do seem to have developed an attachment to those animals. Whitman's gaze moved meaningfully toward Scout, who had crept closer to investigate the stranger. Accidents happen to dogs, Mr. Whitmore, especially dogs owned by uncooperative men. The casual cruelty of the threat ignited something dangerous in Silas's chest. He'd spent 30 years in a profession that demanded emotional distance, but the thought of harm coming to the animals who'd given him their unconditional trust touched a fury he'd thought long buried. Mister, you just made a serious mistake, did I? Whitman remounted his horse with unhurried confidence. I think not. You have 72 hours to consider my offer, Mr. Whitmore. I'll return on Friday for your answer. I trust you'll use that time to make the intelligent choice. As Whitman rode away, Silas remained at the window until the stranger disappeared beyond the ridge. The dogs sensed his mood, gathering closer and watching him with the alert attention they'd learned to associate with danger. Silas returned to the cipher and map with new understanding. These weren't random historical artifacts. They were pieces of a puzzle that led to Confederate gold, probably buried during the final chaotic months of the war when defeat became inevitable. Someone had trusted the owner of this trading post to keep the secret safe, never imagining that 20 years later, a disillusioned outlaw would stumble across their carefully hidden legacy. But why had Cole Brennan really abandoned him? The timing of the gang's sudden moral objection to his mercy toward the puppies seemed too convenient now, too perfectly aligned with his arrival at this particular place. Had Cole known about the documents? Had the entire incident been orchestrated to isolate him here, where he'd be forced to find what others had been seeking? The questions multiplied faster than answers, but one truth emerged with crystalline clarity. Whitman would return as promised, and he wouldn't come alone. 72 hours to prepare for a confrontation that had been decades in the making. A confrontation that would determine whether Ezra, Whitmore's long-buried secrets, would finally claim the life Silas McCrae had, built from their ashes as afternoon shadows lengthened across the trading post. Silas began the methodical work of preparing for war. He'd been a soldier before he was an outlaw, and soldiers understood that the best defense was often knowing your enemy's intentions before he acted on them. The dogs watched him check weapons, inventory ammunition, and survey defensive positions with the patient attention of creatures who'd learned to trust their human's judgment about danger. They didn't understand the complexities of Confederate gold or Union desertion charges, but they understood loyalty, and they understood that sometimes loyalty demanded fighting for what mattered most. By evening, the trading post had transformed from sanctuary into fortress. Silas had turned Ezra Whitmore's greatest shame into Silas McCrae's tactical advantage. After all, who better to guard against military pursuit than a man who'd once been a cavalry scout? The hunted had become the hunter, and Charles Whitman was about to learn that some sleeping dogs were more dangerous when awakened. The ride into Dustwell the next morning felt different from any Silas had taken in recent memory. The weight of the Colt at his hip and the Winchester across his saddle spoke to preparations he hadn't needed to make since his last days with the gang. But more than the familiar comfort of being properly armed, he carried the strange sensation of purpose, not the desperate purpose of a man running from his past, but the focused intent of someone finally ready to face it. Sarah Caldwell looked up from arranging merchandise as he entered the general store, and he saw immediate recognition of the change in him. Where before she'd observed him with careful curiosity, Now her assessment carried the sharp edge of someone evaluating potential danger. Mr. McCrae, her greeting held neither warmth nor coldness, simply the neutral acknowledgement of one careful person greeting another. "You look like a man with something weighing on his mind, Mrs. Caldwell." He touched the brim of his hat. "I'm hoping you might spare a few minutes for conversation. Seems we might have more in common than either of us initially thought." She finished arranging the display of canned goods before responding, her movements deliberate and unhurried, despite the tension that had entered the store with his words. "I'll put the close sign up. Coffee's fresh if you're inclined." While she secured the door and drew the shade, Silas studied the store with new eyes. The arrangement wasn't random. Clear sight lines to both entrances, merchandise positioned to provide cover, and what looked suspiciously like reinforced shelving that could stop small-caliber bullets. Either Sarah Caldwell was unusually paranoid, or she had reason to expect trouble. "You mentioned strangers paying gold for information," he said, when she returned with 2 steaming cups. "I had a visit from one yesterday. Charles Whitman claimed to represent Confederate interests." Sarah's expression didn't change, but her hand stilled on her coffee cup. "What did Mr. Whitman want?" "Documents. Specifically, a Confederate cipher and railroad map that he seemed quite certain I'd found." "And had you?" Silas met her steady gaze. "What I found was a wanted poster with my face on it, dated 20 years ago. Someone's been expecting me to turn up here for a very long time." Sarah Caldwell set down her cup and studied him with the kind of direct assessment he'd learned to associate with former military personnel. When she spoke, her voice carried new authority. "My husband served with the 2nd Colorado Volunteers during the war. Cavalry scout, same as you were if I'm reading the signs correctly. He taught me to recognize certain things about men who'd seen action, how they move, how they position themselves, how they evaluate terrain and exits. Smart man, smart enough to come home when others didn't, smart enough to understand that some conversations are better had with the truth than with careful dancing around it." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words. "He also left me certain items when he passed, items that suggest your Mr. Whitman isn't the only person interested in Confederate artifacts." Sarah rose and moved to a section of shelving that looked identical to all the others. But when she pressed a particular spot, a hidden panel swung open to reveal a small cavity. From it, she withdrew a leather journal bound with a faded ribbon. Thomas kept detailed records of his scouting assignments. Most were routine patrol reports, but toward the end of the war, he was involved in tracking Confederate gold shipments that had gone missing from supply trains. She opened the journal to a page marked with a pressed flower and handed it to Silas. The entry, dated September 1863, detailed the pursuit of a Confederate supply train that had vanished somewhere in the Montana Territory. The description of the cargo made his breath catch: gold coins and bullion worth over $200,000, transported by a small unit that had disappeared. "Without a trace near what was now the dust well area. Your husband was tracking the same gold that Whitman's people are after. Thomas believed the Confederate unit buried their cargo when they realized pursuit was inevitable. He spent weeks searching this area, but never found any trace of their cache." Sarah reclaimed the journal and turned to another marked page. "But he did find something else, evidence that someone local had been helping the Confederates." The second entry described the discovery of a hidden supply depot in what Silas now recognized as the trading post. Thomas Caldwell had found evidence of recent Confederate activity, but no sign of the missing gold. His final notation suggested he'd been ordered to abandon the search without explanation, leading him to suspect political motivations behind the decision. Someone wanted that gold to stay lost, Silas concluded, or wanted it found by the right people at the right time. Sarah closed the journal and met his eyes. Thomas always believed there was more to the story than he'd been told. Before he died, he made me promise to keep watching for signs that someone was still searching. How many others have come through asking questions? Whitman makes 3 in the past 6 months. The first was a woman claiming to be a historical researcher. The second introduced himself as a railroad surveyor, updating old territorial maps. All three asked specific questions about the trading post and whether anyone had taken up residence there. Recently, Silas felt the familiar tightness between his shoulder blades that warned of complicated situations becoming dangerous. Three separate parties tracking the same secret suggested the stakes were higher than simple Confederate nostalgia. "Mrs. Caldwell, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. How much do you know about my background?" Sarah considered the question while refilling their coffee cups. "I know you're not what you pretend to be. You move like a man with military training. You evaluate threats like someone accustomed to being hunted, and you showed up here just as interest in Confederate artifacts started intensifying. Beyond that, I've been content to let you tell me what you choose to share. The truth is complicated. Truth usually is. But Mr. Whitman threatened you yesterday, didn't he? And those threats included the dogs." Silas looked up sharply. "How could you know that?" "Because he visited me first. Wanted to know everything I could tell him about the man with the dogs at the trading post. When I said I barely knew you, he suggested that accidents could happen to people who weren't properly cooperative." Sarah's voice carried an edge of steel that explained the reinforced shelving. "I don't respond well to threats, Mr. McCrae. What did you tell him?" "That I'd never seen you before in my life, which was true at the time. That I had no knowledge of any documents or artifacts, which was also true. And that anyone foolish enough to threaten me in my own store might want to reconsider their approach." Despite the gravity of their situation, Silas found himself almost smiling. "I imagine that conversation didn't go quite as Mr. Whitman expected. He left convinced I was just a frightened widow who'd stumbled into something beyond her understanding. Men like Whitman see what they expect to see when they look at women." Sarah's expression suggested she'd spent considerable time cultivating that particular misconception. "The question now is what we do about the fact that he'll be back." "We." "You think I'm going to let Confederate sympathizers terrorize my town and threaten my neighbors? Thomas didn't fight in that war, so his widow could cower while rebels tried to resurrect their lost cause with stolen gold." Silas studied Sarah Caldwell with new respect. Behind the carefully maintained facade of frontier shopkeeper lay someone with her own reasons for opposing Whitman's mission. Someone who'd spent years preparing for a confrontation she'd hoped would never come. "If we're going to work together, you should know that Charles Whitman isn't my only problem. The outlaw gang that abandoned me here, they might have had their own reasons for making sure I found those documents." "What kind of reasons?" "The kind that involve me being in exactly the right place to take the blame when the shooting starts." Silas finished his coffee and stood. "Mrs. Caldwell, I think we both knew this conversation was coming from the moment I walked into your store. The question is whether you're prepared for what cooperation might cost." Sarah Caldwell rose and moved to another concealed panel, this one revealing a Winchester rifle and ammunition that spoke to serious preparation. "Mr. McCrae, I've been preparing for this conversation for 3 years. The only question is whether you're ready to finish what someone else started 20 years ago." As they shook hands across the counter, Silas felt the strange sensation of doors closing behind him and new ones opening ahead. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone. The third stranger arrived on Thursday afternoon, 48 hours before Whitman's deadline, and precisely when Silas had expected reinforcements to appear. From his position on the ridge above the trading post, he watched a lone rider approach Dustwell from the south, a different direction than Whitman had used, suggesting coordination and tactical thinking. This newcomer rode differently than the well-dressed Confederate sympathizer. Where Whitman had moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation, this rider showed the loose-limbed ease of someone comfortable with long distances and uncertain terrain. "A professional," Silas concluded, "probably a tracker or scout." The dog sensed his tension before he spoke. Scout had taken to ranging farther from the trading post during their morning patrols. his nervous energy suggesting he felt the same pressure building that kept Silas awake at night. Ranger maintained closer positions, never straying beyond quick response distance. Sentry had developed the unsettling habit of staring toward Dustwell for long minutes, as though watching for threats only he could perceive. "Easy, boys," Silas murmured, lowering the field glasses. "Let's see what this one wants before we start making assumptions." But his instincts, honed by 30 years of reading dangerous situations, told him this stranger represented a different kind of threat than Whitman's bluster and political fervor. This felt personal. By evening, word had reached the trading post through the informal network of information that connected isolated frontier communities. The new arrival had taken a room at Dustwell's only boarding house and introduced himself as Professor Marcus Henley, a historian from the University of Chicago researching Civil War artifacts in the Montana Territory. Sarah Caldwell arrived at the trading post just after sunset, her horse lathered from hard riding and her expression tight with concern. "He's not what he claims to be," she said without preamble. "Professor Henley knows far too much about military tactics for an academic, and he's asking questions that suggest he knows exactly what he's looking for." Silas invited her inside, where the warmth of the fire and the comforting presence of the dogs couldn't quite dispel the tension that had followed her from town. "What kind of questions?" "Specific ones about Confederate supply routes through this area. Details about Union cavalry patrols that pursued missing shipments. And most concerning, questions about whether anyone had been seen examining railroad survey maps from the 1860s. He knows about the documents. More than that, he described them in enough detail to suggest he's seen similar materials." Sarah accepted the coffee Silas offered and settled into the chair he'd positioned to maintain sightlines to all approaches. "There's something else." When I mentioned Thomas's service record, Professor Henley knew details about the 2nd Colorado Volunteers that aren't in any public records. Silas felt pieces of a larger puzzle shifting in his mind. 3 separate parties converging on the same secret suggested organization beyond simple coincidence. Someone had been coordinating this search, timing the arrival of different operatives to maximize pressure while maintaining plausible deniability. "Tell me about his horse," Silas said. "Quality animal, well cared for, but showing signs of hard travel. Military saddle, though he's tried to disguise it with civilian tack." Sarah paused, understanding the significance of his question. "You think he's ex-military?" "I think Professor Henley is no more an academic than Charles Whitman is a simple artifact collector." Silas moved to the window, studying the darkening landscape with the automatic caution of a man who'd learned to expect attack from any direction. "The question is whether they're working together or represent competing interests." While they talked, Silas found himself studying Sarah Caldwell with growing appreciation for her tactical understanding. She'd positioned herself to maintain sight lines similar to his own, kept her rifle within easy reach, and demonstrated the kind of situational awareness that suggested extensive training or bitter experience. "Mrs. Caldwell, there's something I need to tell you about my background. Something that might explain why these people are so interested in making sure I'm the one who found those documents." Sarah set down her coffee and gave him her complete attention. "I'm listening. 23 years ago, I was a Union cavalry scout named Ezra Whitmore. My unit was tasked with tracking Confederate gold shipments that had gone missing in this territory. We found evidence of the same supply depot your husband discovered, but our investigation was terminated without explanation. Someone didn't want you to find that gold, or they wanted to make sure it stayed lost until they were ready to retrieve it." Silas returned to his chair, the confession carrying a weight he'd been carrying alone for too long. "But there's more. 3 weeks before my unit was disbanded, I encountered a young Confederate soldier who'd been separated from his unit. Standard procedure would have been to take him prisoner, but he was wounded and alone. Barely 18 years old. You let him go. I gave him water, medical supplies, and directions to Confederate lines. It was a small mercy that seemed insignificant at the time. Silas paused, the memory carrying emotions he'd thought long buried. That soldier gave me something in return. A brass compass that had belonged to his grandfather, a token of gratitude from someone who understood he should have been dead. Sarah leaned forward, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. The compass is connected to the documents. The young soldier's name was Lieutenant James Whitmore, no relation despite the shared surname. He commanded the Confederate unit that buried the gold shipment your husband was tracking. Silas moved to his saddlebags and withdrew the brass compass he'd carried for over 2 decades. This compass contains the second cipher, the one that reveals the true location of the cache. The compass was beautifully crafted, its brass surface engraved with intricate markings that appeared decorative until examined closely. Sarah studied the engravings, while Silas explained how he'd discovered their significance only after finding the Confederate documents. The cipher I found beneath the floorboards was incomplete by design. Lieutenant Whitmore split the location information between the written cipher and these compass markings. 2 people would need to cooperate to find the gold, one with the documents, one with the compass. But you have both pieces. Through coincidence, that's starting to feel less coincidental with each passing day. Silas returned the compass to his pocket. I think someone's been orchestrating this reunion for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to bring all the pieces together. Their conversation was interrupted by Scout's low growl, followed immediately by Ranger's more aggressive warning. Both dogs had positioned themselves at the front window, their attention focused on the approach to the trading post. Silas moved to the window and spotted a figure on foot, moving carefully through the shadows beyond the main path. Not approaching directly, but circling the building at a distance that suggested reconnaissance rather than casual visit. Professor Henley, Sarah whispered, or someone working with him. Silas extinguished the oil lamp, plunging the interior into darkness, broken only by firelight. Mrs. Caldwell, I need you to position yourself by the back door. If shooting starts, get to your horse and ride for town. I'm not leaving you to face this alone. You're not armed for this kind of fight, and I won't have your death on my conscience. Silas checked his weapons while maintaining watch on the circling figure. This is what I do, Sarah. What I've always done when talking stops working. But even as he spoke, Silas realized something had changed in his approach to conflict. For 30 years, his primary concern had been his own survival, with loyalty to the gang running a distant second. Now, the thought of harm coming to Sarah Caldwell or the dogs touched something in him that demanded protection rather than simple self-preservation. The figure completed its circuit and melted back into the darkness, leaving Silas with the unsettling certainty that the trading post's defenses had been mapped and evaluated. Tomorrow would bring Whitman's deadline, but tonight had demonstrated that their enemies weren't waiting for formal negotiations to conclude. He's gone, Silas said quietly, but kept the lamp extinguished. Professional reconnaissance. They're planning something more sophisticated than a simple confrontation. Sarah remained at her position by the back door. What do we do? We stop reacting to their moves and start making some of our own. Silas moved to the hidden cache where he kept the Confederate documents. Tomorrow morning, I'm riding to Dustwell to have a conversation with Professor Henley. Time to find out whether he's working with Whitman or representing a third party. That could be walking into a trap. Could be. But sitting here, waiting for them to make the next move, guarantees we'll be fighting on their terms. Silas met her eyes across the darkened room. Sarah, there's something else you should know. That young Confederate soldier I helped 20 years ago? According to the records I've found, Lieutenant James Whitmore died of his wounds 3 days after I encountered him. Then who's been carrying the compass all this time? Someone who wanted me to believe I was the only person who could solve this puzzle. Someone who's been very patient about engineering this exact situation. Silas felt the weight of manipulation settling around him like a familiar coat. Tomorrow we find out who's been pulling the strings. The dogs settled into their nighttime positions, but their alertness suggested they shared their human certainty that rest would be temporary. Outside, the Montana wind carried the first hints of the winter storms that would soon lock the high country in isolation, cutting off escape routes and forcing all parties toward a resolution that had been building for 23 years. Silas checked his weapons one final time and settled into the chair that gave him the best view of all approaches. Sarah Caldwell had agreed to stay the night, taking the back room where she could maintain watch on the rear approaches while remaining close enough to coordinate their defense. As the fire burned low and shadows deepened, Silas reflected on the strange turns that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a discarded outlaw with nothing but guilty conscience and 3 unwanted puppies. Now he sat at the center of a mystery that reached back to the Civil War, surrounded by allies he'd never expected to find, and facing enemies whose true motivations remained hidden. The brass compass seemed to pulse with warmth in his pocket, a reminder that some acts of mercy cast shadows that stretched across decades. Tomorrow would bring answers, and with them, the kind of reckoning that Ezra Whitmore had been avoiding since he became Silas McCrae. Dawn brought clarity and resolve in equal measure. Silas woke before first light, as had been his habit since cavalry days, and found Sarah already awake and preparing coffee with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to early hours and dangerous situations. The dogs had maintained their vigil through the night, and their alert but calm demeanor suggested no further reconnaissance had occurred. "Sleep at all?" Sarah asked, handing him a steaming cup. "Enough." Silas studied the morning light filtering through the windows, automatically calculating visibility, weather conditions, and tactical advantages. Time to stop letting them control this situation. After Sarah departed for town to maintain the appearance of normal routine, Silas made his way to the hidden cache beneath the trading post's main room. But instead of retrieving the Confederate documents, he moved a section of floorboard that concealed his most personal secret, the ceremonial cavalry saber he'd carried during his service as Ezra Whitmore. The weapon had been a gift from his commanding officer after a particularly successful reconnaissance mission behind Confederate lines. Its blade bore the inscription, "For valor in service of Union and liberty," words that had once defined his understanding of right and wrong. He'd buried it here during his first week at the trading post, unable to display it, but unwilling to abandon the last tangible connection to the man he'd once been. Now, as he lifted the saber from its hiding place, Silas felt the weight of more than steel and brass. This blade represented the honor he'd thought lost, the principles he'd believed corrupted beyond recovery. Carrying it again meant accepting that Ezra Whitmore and Silas McCrae were not separate men, but different aspects of the same person, one who'd lost his way, but hadn't lost everything worth preserving. The ride to Dustwell felt like a journey between two worlds. Behind him lay the sanctuary he'd built around his guilt and isolation. Ahead waited the confrontation that would determine whether redemption was possible or merely another form of self-deception. The dogs ranged alongside his horse, their presence a constant reminder that some bonds transcended questions of worthiness or past mistakes. He found Professor Henley in Dustwell's small restaurant, calmly eating breakfast while reading what appeared to be academic journals. Up close, the man's deception became more apparent. His hands bore the calluses of someone accustomed to hard physical labor. His posture held the alertness of a trained soldier, and his eyes carried the particular wariness that came from years of expecting violence. Professor Henley. Silas took the seat across from him without invitation. "I believe we have mutual interests to discuss." The man, calling himself Henley, set down his coffee and studied Silas with the direct assessment of one professional evaluating another. "Mr. McCrae, or do you prefer Whitmore? I confess to some uncertainty about which name represents the real man. Both names belong to me. The question is, which one you're here to deal with? I'm here to deal with the man who holds the key to completing A mission that's been 23 years in the making. Henley folded his hands on the table, the gesture revealing old scars that spoke of military service. My name is Captain David Morrison, United States Army Intelligence. I've been tracking Confederate gold shipments since 1875. The admission hit Silas like a physical blow. Not another treasure hunter or Confederate sympathizer, but a federal agent who'd been conducting an investigation that spanned decades. What's the Army's interest in Civil War artifacts? The same interest we've had since the war ended, preventing enemies of the Union from funding future rebellion. Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. The Confederate gold you found isn't just historical curiosity, Whitmore. It's part of a larger cache that unreconstructed rebels have been using to fund anti-government activities for 20 years. Activities like what? Like the assassination of federal judges who ruled against Confederate veterans' pension claims. Like funding newspaper campaigns designed to undermine Reconstruction policies. Like purchasing weapons for militia groups that still dream of Southern independence. Morrison leaned forward, his intensity unmistakable. That gold has been responsible for more American deaths since the war than during some of the major battles. Silas felt the familiar sensation of political complexity intruding on what he'd hoped would remain a personal matter. And you think I'm going to help you continue some federal vendetta against defeated enemies? I think you're going to help me prevent Charles Whitman and his associates from accessing funds that will be used to kill federal agents and loyal American citizens. Morrison's tone carried no compromise. Unless, of course, your sympathies lie with the Confederacy after all these years. The challenge was expertly delivered, designed to force Silas into declaring loyalty to principles he'd once fought to defend. But 30 years of outlaw living had taught him to recognize manipulation regardless of how skillfully presented. My sympathies lie with being left alone to live my life in peace. But peace seems to be in short supply around here lately. Silas signaled the waitress for coffee, buying time to evaluate this new development. Captain Morrison, why didn't the Army pursue this investigation 20 years ago when the trail was fresh? Because 20 years ago, certain political considerations made it expedient to let sleeping dogs lie. The country was trying to heal, and pursuing Confederate gold caches seemed likely to reopen wounds we were trying to close. Morrison's expression suggested personal disagreement with those long-ago decisions. Recent events have changed that calculation. What recent events? The formation of a Confederate veterans organization that's been using coded communications and secret meetings to coordinate activities across multiple states. An organization that's been very interested in recovering historical artifacts that belong to their membership. Morrison withdrew a photograph from his jacket and placed it on the table. An organization led by Charles Whitman. The photograph showed Whitman in Confederate officer's uniform, surrounded by men whose faces held the particular hardness that came from nursing old grievances into active hatred. But what caught Silas's attention was the banner behind them, Sons of Confederate Veterans, Montana Chapter, and the date notation indicating the photograph was less than 6 months old. They're planning something, Silas concluded. They're planning to use that gold to purchase weapons and explosives for an attack on the federal courthouse in Helena. 3 federal judges and a dozen federal marshals will be in that building next month for a territorial law conference. Morrison's voice carried deadly certainty. Unless we stop them first. Silas studied the photograph while his mind raced through implications. What had seemed like a personal confrontation with his past had revealed itself as part of a larger conspiracy that threatened innocent lives. The weight of the cavalry saber at his side seemed to increase as he contemplated the choice before him. What exactly are you asking me to do, Captain? Help me recover that gold before Whitman's people can claim it. Use your knowledge of the cipher and map to locate the cache, then assist in arresting the conspirators when they arrive to claim their prize. Morrison met his eyes directly. In exchange, the Army will consider your service record cleared of any outstanding questions. And if I refuse, then you'll be arrested as a Confederate sympathizer and charged with conspiracy to commit treason against the United States." Morrison's tone carried no emotion, simply the flat certainty of a man stating inevitable consequences. "The choice is yours, Whitmore, but the mission will proceed with or without your cooperation." Silas felt the walls closing around him with the inexorable pressure of political forces that recognized no middle ground between loyalty and treachery. The life he'd tried to build at the trading post, the peace he'd found with Sarah and the dogs, the simple hope of redemption through quiet decency, all balanced on a decision that would determine whether Ezra Whitmore's mistakes would finally claim everything Silas McCrae had tried to become. The walk back to the trading post felt longer than the miles warranted, weighted by decisions that would reshape not only his own future, but the lives of everyone who'd become entangled in this decades-old conspiracy. Captain Morrison had given him until evening to provide an answer, time that felt simultaneously too brief and unbearably extended. Sarah was waiting for him when he arrived, her expression immediately registering the gravity of whatever had transpired in town. The dogs gathered around him with unusual intensity, as though sensing the emotional turmoil that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. "What did Professor Henley want?" she asked as they settled inside the trading post. "To recruit me for a federal operation against Confederate conspirators. Turns out Professor Henley is actually Captain David Morrison, Army intelligence, and he's been tracking the same gold cache for 20 years. Silas related the conversation, while Sarah's expression shifted from concern to alarm to something approaching. "Fear federal agents," she said quietly when he finished. "Thomas always said they were the most dangerous people to deal with because they believed their cause justified any means necessary. Morrison threatened to arrest me for treason if I don't cooperate. And if you do cooperate, then I help him set a trap for Whitman and his conspirators, using myself as bait to draw them to the gold cache." Silas moved to the window, studying the landscape that had become both sanctuary and prison. "Either way, the quiet life I was hoping to build here ends today." Sarah joined him at the window, her presence offering comfort that had become essential to his sense of stability. "There's something else you should know. Something I found among Thomas's papers after you left this morning." She handed him a small, leather-bound notebook he hadn't seen before, its pages filled with her late husband's careful handwriting. The entries detailed his growing suspicion that his orders to abandon the Confederate gold investigation had come not from military necessity, but from political pressure applied by unknown parties. Thomas believed someone in the federal government was protecting the Confederate conspirators, Sarah explained. His final entries suggest he'd identified specific officials who were deliberately hampering the investigation. Silas read through the notebook with growing unease. Thomas Caldwell had documented a pattern of interference that suggested corruption at high levels of territorial government. Names appeared repeatedly: federal judges, territorial administrators, and military officers who seemed unusually interested in ensuring the Confederate gold remained undiscovered. "Judge Harrison Blackwood," Silas read aloud. "Territorial Governor Marcus Whitfield. Colonel James Patterson." He looked up at Sarah. "Your husband thought these men were working with the Confederates, or being blackmailed by them." Thomas believed the conspiracy reached deeper than simple Confederate sympathizers seeking lost treasure. Sarah pointed to a particular entry dated just weeks before Thomas's death. He thought someone was using the gold as leverage to control territorial politics. The implications staggered Silas. If Thomas Caldwell was correct, then the Confederate gold represented more than funding for future attacks. It was the foundation of a shadow government that had been manipulating territorial affairs for 2 decades. "Sarah, what if Captain Morrison isn't who he claims to be? What if this entire federal investigation is designed to eliminate witnesses rather than prevent attacks?" Before she could respond, Scout's sharp bark announced approaching riders. Through the window, they watched three horsemen crest the ridge overlooking the trading post, moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew their destination and expected no resistance. Whitman, Silas identified, recognizing the Confederate sympathizer's distinctive posture. And two companions. The second rider sat his horse with military bearing that suggested professional soldier rather than political enthusiast. The third appeared younger, perhaps 30, with the lean build and alert manner of a man accustomed to dangerous work. "They're early," Sarah observed. "Morrison said Whitman's deadline was this evening. Morrison lied about something. Question is what else he's been lying about." Silas checked his weapons while considering options that had narrowed to unpleasant alternatives. "Sarah, I want you to take the back trail to town. If shooting starts, find the sheriff and tell him what's happening. I'm not leaving you to face 3 armed men alone. You're not armed for this kind of fight." "And Mr. McCrae," she interrupted, moving to the concealed cache where she'd stored her Winchester. "I've been preparing for this confrontation for 3 years. I'm not running when it finally arrives." As she spoke, Sarah produced not only the rifle, but a gun belt that held a Colt revolver of recent manufacture. Her movements with the weapons spoke of extensive training and comfortable familiarity. "Thomas taught me to shoot," she said in response to his surprised expression. "But I taught myself to fight." The approaching riders stopped 50 yards from the trading post, positioning themselves to control the main approach while maintaining clear fields of fire. Whitman dismounted and walked slowly toward the building, his hands visible but his companions remaining mounted and alert. "Mr. McCrae," Whitman called, "I believe we have business to conclude." Silas stepped onto the trading post's small porch, the cavalry saber at his side, catching afternoon sunlight. "Mr. Whitman, you're ahead of schedule. Circumstances have accelerated our timeline. I trust you've had adequate opportunity to consider my proposal." "I've had opportunity to consider several proposals. Seems there's considerable interest in Confederate artifacts these days." Whitman's expression sharpened. "What other proposals?" "Federal agents, Confederate sympathizers, mysterious professors, quite a gathering for such a remote location." Silas let his hand rest casually on the saber's hilt. "Makes a man wonder if he's been brought here for purposes beyond his own choosing." "You found the documents," Whitman said, abandoning any pretense of negotiation. "And you have the compass that completes the cipher. Those items belong to the Confederate cause, and I'm prepared to take them by whatever means necessary." "Interesting perspective. Captain Morrison seems to think they belong to the federal government." The mention of Morrison's real identity and rank caused visible shock among the 3 riders. The military-bearing man immediately reached for his weapon, while the younger rider began maneuvering for a flanking position. "Morrison," Whitman breathed. "How long has he been here?" "Long enough to know about your plans for the Helena courthouse." "Long enough to set his own trap." Silas smiled grimly. "Question is whether you're walking into his trap or I'm walking into yours." The standoff crystallized in that moment. 3 armed men facing a trading post that might contain federal agents, Confederate conspirators, or simply a former outlaw and a widow who'd chosen the wrong side of a very old war. "Mr. Whitman," Silas continued, "before this turns into something we'll all regret, maybe you'd like to explain exactly how you knew I'd be the one to find those documents. Because the more I think about it, the more I suspect this whole situation was arranged by someone with interests that don't align with either Confederate resurrection or federal justice. The dogs had positioned themselves in a defensive formation around the trading post, their behavior suggesting they sensed the violence that hung in the air like approaching thunder. In the distance, storm clouds gathered over the peaks, promising the kind of weather that would trap everyone in the valley until spring, or until only one faction remained standing. Whitman's response would determine whether the next few minutes brought answers or bloodshed. But Silas suspected that after 23 years of careful planning, someone had decided that talking time was over. Whitman's response never came. Instead, the sound of approaching horses from the opposite direction announced the arrival of Captain Morrison and what appeared to be a full squad of federal agents. The tactical situation shifted from tense standoff to potential massacre as two armed groups found themselves facing each other across the trading post where Silas and Sarah waited for violence that seemed inevitable. "Stand down," Morrison shouted, his voice carrying military authority as he and 6 mounted agents took positions that effectively surrounded Whitman's smaller group. "You're all under arrest for conspiracy against the United States government." But instead of the immediate surrender or desperate firefight that Silas expected, Whitman began laughing, a sound that carried bitter amusement rather than fear or desperation. "Captain Morrison," Whitman called out, his voice carrying across the valley. "Still following orders from Colonel Patterson, I see." "Some things never change." Morrison's reaction was immediate and telling. His confident posture shifted to something approaching uncertainty, and Silas caught the brief exchange of glances between the supposed federal agents that suggested prior coordination rather than professional law enforcement. "Sarah," Silas said quietly, not moving from his position on the porch, "I think we've been played by both sides." Inside the trading post, he could hear the dogs moving restlessly, their behavior suggesting they sensed deception, even if they couldn't understand its source. Scout had begun the low whining that preceded his most agitated warnings, while Ranger positioned himself where he could watch both groups of armed men simultaneously. "Mr. Whitman," Silas called, his voice carrying across the increasingly charged atmosphere, "perhaps you'd care to explain what Colonel Patterson has to do with Captain Morrison's investigation. Because Captain Morrison has been reporting to Colonel Patterson for 20 years, just as I have." Whitman's tone carried the satisfaction of a man revealing a long-held secret. "There never was a Confederate conspiracy to attack federal buildings, McCrae. There was only a federal conspiracy to control territorial resources using Confederate gold as funding." The admission hung in the air like a gunshot, reshaping everything Silas thought he understood about the forces that had brought him to this moment. Morrison's federal agents were corrupt officials using their authority to eliminate witnesses to government corruption. Whitman's Confederate sympathizers were actually federal operatives maintaining the fiction of ongoing rebellion to justify continued military oversight of territorial affairs. "The gold," Silas said, understanding flooding through him. "It was never lost. It was deliberately hidden to fund black operations that couldn't be traced to official government sources." "Very good!" Morrison called out, abandoning any pretense of legitimate federal authority. The territorial government needed funding for activities that Congress wouldn't approve, suppressing Indian uprisings, eliminating troublesome mining claims, ensuring cooperative local officials remained in power. Confederate gold provided the perfect solution. Sarah emerged from the trading post carrying her Winchester, her expression suggesting she'd reached similar conclusions. "And my husband discovered what you were doing." Thomas Caldwell was an idealistic fool who couldn't understand political necessity, Morrison replied. "His death was regrettable but unavoidable." The casual admission of murder crystallized everything for Silas. These weren't opposing factions fighting over Civil War artifacts. They were corrupt government officials who'd been using him to locate resources they'd hidden decades earlier. The Confederate documents, the federal investigation, even his own exile from the Burnt Ridge Gang had been orchestrated to bring him to this place at this time. "Cole Brennan," Silas said, the final piece falling into place. "He's working for you." "Cole has been a federal asset for 10 years, Morrison confirmed. "The Burnt Ridge Gang provided excellent cover for our agents to move freely through the territory while monitoring potential threats to our operations. The Puppies weren't random. You needed me to show mercy, to establish character that would make Sarah trust me enough to share her husband's research. Sarah Caldwell possessed half the information we needed to locate the gold cache. You possessed the skills necessary to decipher the location. Bringing you together required careful manipulation, But the results justified the effort. Silas felt the rage building in his chest, not the hot anger of immediate conflict, but the cold fury of a man who'd discovered that his entire life had been manipulated by forces he'd never suspected. The guilt he'd carried over abandoning his military service, the isolation he'd accepted as just punishment for his failures, the desperate hope for redemption he'd found in Sarah's companionship, all of it had been engineered by corrupt officials who viewed human lives as expendable resources. The compass, Sarah said suddenly. They still need the compass to complete the cipher. Silas touched the brass instrument in his pocket, understanding that it represented the only leverage they possessed in a situation that had shifted from dangerous to deadly. Without the compass markings, even Morrison's corrupt agents couldn't locate the exact burial site of the Confederate gold. "That's right," Whitman called. "And Mr. McCrae is going to provide it willingly, because the alternative is watching everyone he's grown to care about die slowly and painfully." "The dogs first," Morrison added. "Then Mrs. Caldwell, then you, McCrae, but only after you've watched what happens to creatures that depend on your protection." The threat ignited something primal in Silas that 30 years of outlaw living had never quite suppressed. These men had manipulated his guilt over past failures, exploited his desire for redemption, and now threatened the only beings who'd offered him unconditional acceptance. They'd turned his greatest shame into a weapon against his greatest hope. "Gentlemen," Silas said, his voice carrying the deadly calm that had preceded his most violent actions during the war, "I believe you've made a serious miscalculation." From inside the trading post came the sound of breaking glass, followed immediately by Scout's sharp bark of alarm. But instead of attack, the sound announced the arrival of a fourth party, half a dozen riders approaching from the direction of Dustwell, led by a figure Silas recognized with shock that bordered on disbelief. Cole Brennan rode at the head of the approaching group. But his positioning and the drawn weapons of his companions suggested something far different from the federal asset Morrison had claimed. "Sorry I'm late." "Silas," Cole called out, as his riders took positions that effectively surrounded both Morrison's agents and Whitman's operatives. "Took longer than expected to gather the evidence we needed to prove what these bastards have been doing." The trading post had become the center of a four-way standoff that defied everything Silas thought he understood about loyalty, betrayal, and the true cost of secrets that powerful men would kill to protect. In his pocket, the brass compass seemed to pulse with heat that matched his growing understanding that this confrontation would determine not only who controlled the Confederate gold, but whether justice was possible for crimes that reached back 20 years into America's bloodiest conflict. The valley had become a powder keg, with 4 different fuses burning toward the same explosive center. Morrison's corrupt federal agents held the high ground to the north. Whitman's operatives controlled the eastern approach. Cole Brennan's riders commanded the southern route. And Silas found himself at the center with Sarah and the dogs, holding the one piece of information that everyone needed, but nobody could claim without triggering a massacre. "Cole," Silas called out, his voice cutting through the tension. "Explain yourself." "Been working undercover for the real federal investigators for 2 years. Silas, Morrison and his crew have been using government authority to line their own pockets while framing innocent people for crimes they didn't commit." Cole's rifle remained trained on Morrison's position. "The Burnt Ridge Gang was my cover to get close enough to gather evidence." "Evidence of what?" "Murder, theft, conspiracy, and treason on a scale that reaches all the way to Washington." Cole reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a thick envelope. Thomas Caldwell wasn't the only one they killed. 15 people over the past decade, all because they got too close to discovering the truth about territorial corruption. Morrison's response was immediate and predictable. "Brennan's a known outlaw with a federal warrant on his head. Whatever evidence he claims to possess was obtained through criminal activity and can't be trusted." "Maybe," Sarah said, stepping forward with her Winchester held ready. "But I have evidence too. Evidence my husband gathered before they murdered him. She produced the leather journal that contained Thomas Caldwell's detailed documentation of federal corruption. But this time, she opened it to pages Silas hadn't seen before, pages that contained photographs of documents, correspondence between corrupt officials, and financial records that traced Confederate gold funding back to its sources. Thomas was more thorough than they realized, Sarah continued. He documented everything, names, dates, amounts, and most importantly, the location where they've been storing stolen territorial resources for 20 years. Whitman shifted nervously in his saddle. Mrs. Caldwell, you don't understand the forces you're dealing with. Some secrets are too dangerous for civilians to possess. I understand that you people murdered my husband to protect your illegal operation. I understand that you've been using federal authority to terrorize innocent people while enriching yourselves. Sarah's voice carried the steel that came from grief, transformed into purpose. And I understand that today, it ends. The standoff continued with mounting tension as each group maintained position while calculating odds and angles. But Silas noticed something that the others seemed to have missed: additional riders approaching from the west, moving with the disciplined formation that suggested legitimate military authority rather than corrupt operatives. Cole, he said quietly. Company coming from the western ridge. Cole glanced in the indicated direction and smiled grimly. About time. That'll be Colonel Marcus Thompson and the real federal investigators. The approaching riders numbered at least 20, flying the colors of the United States Army and moving with the purposeful advance of soldiers operating under legitimate orders. As they drew closer, their leader's voice carried across the valley with the authority of genuine federal command. This is Colonel Thompson, United States Army Criminal Investigation Division. All armed parties will stand down immediately and prepare for federal custody. Morrison's reaction was immediate and desperate. Open fire! Brennan's people are outlaws attempting to interfere with a federal operation. The valley erupted into chaos as 3 different groups of armed men began shooting in multiple directions while trying to avoid hitting their own allies in the crossfire. Silas grabbed Sarah and pulled her toward the cover of the trading post's stone foundation, while the dogs scattered to positions that offered protection from stray bullets. The cache! Morrison shouted over the gunfire. We need that compass before Thompson's people secure the area. Like hell, Silas replied, drawing his Colt and returning fire at Morrison's agents, who were attempting to advance on the trading post under cover of the general confusion. But the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Morrison's corrupt agents were professional soldiers who knew how to coordinate their fire and movement. Whitman's operatives possessed similar training and equipment. Cole's gang members were experienced fighters but lacked military discipline, and Colonel Thompson's legitimate federal forces were advancing steadily but couldn't distinguish between criminals and victims in the melee. Sarah, Silas said during a brief lull in the shooting, we need to break this stalemate before everyone gets killed. How much does Thomas's journal reveal about the actual cache location? Everything. Coordinates, landmarks, even detailed sketches of the burial site. Sarah reloaded her Winchester with practiced efficiency. Thomas found it 2 years before they killed him, but he never reported its location because he suspected federal corruption. Then, we have what we need to end this. Silas made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed over 30 years of dangerous living. I'm going to signal Thompson's forces and surrender the compass and documents. That's suicide. Morrison's people will kill you before you get halfway to the federal lines. Maybe, but continuing this standoff guarantees that innocent people die while guilty ones escape. Silas checked his weapons and prepared for what might be his final act as a free man. Sarah, if something happens to me, make sure Thompson gets Thomas's journal. The truth needs to come out. Silas, wait. But he was already moving, using the cover of gunsmoke and confusion to work his way toward the legitimate federal position. The dogs, recognizing his intent, began their own movement, not following him into danger, but positioning themselves to create distractions that would draw hostile fire away from their human scout. True to his nature, began circling wide around Morrison's position, his movement forcing the corrupt agents to divide their attention. Ranger moved directly toward Whitman's operatives, his aggressive advance causing them to shift position to avoid what they perceived as a flanking attack. Sentry, with the wisdom that had earned his name, remained near Sarah to provide close protection. The distraction worked better than Silas had hoped. In the confusion of tracking multiple moving targets, the hostile forces lost sight of his advance toward Colonel Thompson's position. But just as he reached calling distance of the legitimate federal forces, a new voice cut through the chaos with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Ceasefire. All parties cease fire immediately." The voice belonged to a tall man in civilian clothes who rode between the combatants with the calm confidence of someone who expected his orders to be obeyed. As the shooting gradually stopped, Silas recognized him from wanted posters and newspaper sketches. Judge Marcus Whitfield, the territorial governor whose corruption Thomas Caldwell had documented. "Governor Whitfield," Morrison called out, "thank God you're here. We have the situation under control." "No, Captain Morrison, you do not." Whitfield's tone carried deadly certainty. "You have created a situation that threatens to expose 20 years of careful planning. That is the opposite of control." The governor's arrival shifted the dynamic once again, adding a fifth faction to an already complex situation. But as Whitfield continued speaking, Silas realized that this wasn't another competing interest. This was the man who'd been orchestrating everything from the beginning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Whitfield announced to the assembled groups, "you are all participants in an operation that has reached its conclusion. The Confederate gold cash will be recovered under territorial authority. The evidence of federal corruption will be suppressed for national security reasons, and those responsible for interfering with government operations will be dealt with appropriately. Like you dealt with Thomas Caldwell?" Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the valley. "Thomas Caldwell died because he couldn't understand that some truths are too dangerous for public consumption. His death was regrettable but necessary." Whitfield's response carried no emotion, simply the flat certainty of a man who'd made similar decisions many times before. "The same fate awaits anyone who insists on pursuing matters that are better left buried." The brass compass seemed to burn in Silas's pocket as he understood the scope of the conspiracy he'd stumbled into. Not just corrupt federal agents or Confederate sympathizers, but territorial officials who'd been using both groups to maintain control over resources and power that rightfully belonged to the people they'd sworn to serve. In the distance, storm clouds continued building over the peaks, promising weather that would trap everyone in the valley until this confrontation reached its inevitable conclusion. But now Silas understood that the real storm had been building for 20 years, and today would determine whether justice was possible or whether corruption had grown too powerful to challenge. The dogs had returned to defensive positions around the trading post, their loyalty unchanged, despite the complexity of human motivations that swirled around them. In their simple devotion, Silas found the clarity he needed to make his final choice between survival and principle. The moment of decision crystallized when Governor Whitfield dismounted and began walking toward the trading post, with the casual confidence of a man who believed his authority was absolute. Behind him, his personal guard took positions that demonstrated this wasn't negotiation. It was annexation of everything and everyone who posed a threat to 20 years of carefully constructed corruption. "Mr. McCrae," Whitfield called out, his voice carrying the tone of reasonable authority that had served him well in political circles. "I believe you have something that belongs to the territorial government. I'm prepared to offer generous compensation for your cooperation." Silas remained behind the stone foundation, the cavalry saber at his side catching afternoon light as storm clouds gathered overhead. Governor, I'm not sure anything about this situation belongs to legitimate government. Legitimacy is determined by those with the power to enforce their decisions, not by idealistic notions of justice or honor. Whitfield stopped 30 yards from the trading post, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid immediate danger. You've stumbled into affairs that are beyond your understanding or authority to judge. Maybe, but I understand murder, and I understand theft. And I understand that Thomas Caldwell died because he threatened your operation. Silas felt the weight of the brass compass in his pocket, the one piece of information that could either end this confrontation or escalate it beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. Sarah emerged from her position behind the trading post's corner, her Winchester held ready but not immediately threatening. Governor Whitfield, my husband documented everything. Every transaction, every murder, every abuse of federal authority that you've orchestrated over the past 20 years. Mrs. Caldwell, your husband was a dangerous idealist who couldn't understand political reality. His death was an unfortunate necessity, but his misguided investigation threatened the stability of territorial governance. Whitfield's tone suggested he genuinely believed his own justifications. The resources we've directed toward maintaining order have prevented far greater bloodshed and chaos. By murdering 15 innocent people, by eliminating threats to territorial stability before they could destabilize the region. Whitfield gestured toward the armed groups surrounding the trading post. Do you see what happens when careful control breaks down? Violence, chaos, and the threat of federal intervention that would destroy everything we've built. But even as Whitfield spoke, Silas noticed movement among Colonel Thompson's legitimate federal forces. They were advancing under cover of the conversation, using the terrain to position themselves for a coordinated assault on all the corrupt factions simultaneously. Thompson had recognized that negotiation wasn't possible. Only decisive action would end this confrontation. Governor, Silas called out, drawing Whitfield's attention back to him. You're assuming I care about territorial stability more than justice for murdered friends. I'm assuming you care about survival more than abstract principles. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and facing charges of treason if you continue to resist legitimate authority. Legitimate authority. Silas stood, the cavalry saber now visible at his side. You know what legitimate authority looks like, Governor? It looks like Colonel Thompson's forces moving into position behind your corrupt operatives. Whitfield spun to see Thompson's soldiers emerging from concealed positions with the coordinated precision of a military operation that had been planned and rehearsed. His personal guard immediately shifted to defensive positions, but they were facing professional soldiers who possessed overwhelming tactical advantages. Surrender your weapons. Thompson's voice carried across the valley with absolute authority. All parties are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States. The response was immediate chaos as multiple factions began shooting in different directions while trying to avoid capture by the one group that represented legitimate federal authority. Morrison's corrupt agents attempted to fight their way toward the trading post, where they believed the compass was hidden. Whitman's operatives tried to reach higher ground where they could establish defensive positions. Whitfield's personal guard formed a protective circle around the governor while returning fire at Thompson's advancing soldiers. In the midst of the firefight, Cole Brennan's gang members proved their worth by targeting the most dangerous corrupt agents first. Their outlaw experience translating into effective combat against enemies who'd never faced opponents with nothing left to lose. Sarah, Silas shouted over the gunfire. Get to the root cellar and stay down. But Sarah Caldwell had other ideas. Instead of seeking shelter, she moved to a position that gave her clear shots at Morrison's agents who were advancing on the trading post. Her Winchester spoke with deadly accuracy, dropping 2 corrupt federal agents before they could reach the building's perimeter. The dogs had scattered according to their individual natures, but remained focused on protecting their human family. Scout used his speed and agility to harass enemies who tried to flank the trading post, his sudden appearances disrupting their coordination. Ranger had positioned himself between Sarah and the most immediate threats, ready to attack anyone who got too close. Sentry maintained overwatch from an elevated position, his alert presence providing early warning of new dangers. But the tactical situation remained desperate. Thompson's legitimate forces were advancing steadily, but they were hampered by the need to distinguish between criminals and victims in the chaotic firefight. The corrupt factions possessed professional military training and equipment, making them dangerous opponents even when facing superior numbers. McCrae. Morrison's voice cut through the gunfire as he and two remaining agents reached the trading post's perimeter. "Give us the compass or we start killing your animals." The threat ignited the cold fury that had been building in Silas since he'd learned the scope of the conspiracy that had manipulated his entire life. These men had orchestrated his exile from the gang, engineered his isolation at the trading post, and murdered innocent people to protect their illegal operation. Now they threatened the beings who'd offered him unconditional loyalty and affection. "Morrison!" Silas stepped into the open, the cavalry saber gleaming in his right hand, while his left held the Colt that had served him through 30 years of dangerous living. "You want the compass? Come and take it." The challenge was answered immediately as Morrison and his two agents attempted a coordinated assault on the trading post. But they were facing not just an aging outlaw, but a former Union cavalry scout who'd spent decades perfecting the art of violence in service of causes both worthy and corrupt. Silas's first shot took Morrison center mass. The corrupt captain, falling with a look of surprise that suggested he'd never expected real resistance from a man he'd dismissed as a broken-down criminal. The second agent died when Sarah's Winchester spoke from the window, her shot perfectly timed to support Silas's advance. The third agent, younger and faster than his companions, managed to reach close quarters where his military training gave him temporary advantage. But close quarters was where the cavalry saber proved its worth, its blade finding its target with the precision that came from decades of practice and the desperation that came from protecting everything that mattered. As Morrison's corrupt agents fell, the broader firefight continued with Thompson's legitimate forces gradually gaining ground against the remaining hostile factions. But Governor Whitfield had begun a fighting retreat toward higher ground, his personal guard covering his withdrawal with disciplined fire that suggested they understood the stakes of allowing their employer to be captured alive. "He's getting away," Sarah called out, pointing toward Whitfield's retreating group. "Not if I can help it," Cole Brennan replied, spurring his horse toward the retreating governor, with two of his gang members following close behind. The pursuit wound up the rocky slope above the trading post, where winter storms had carved a landscape of boulders and crevices that provided excellent cover for both pursuers and pursued. But as the chase reached the ridgeline, a new sound echoed across the valley, the deep rumble of approaching thunder that promised the kind of mountain storm that could trap everyone. In the high country until spring, the confrontation that had been building for 20 years was approaching its climax on ground where the weather itself would soon become a factor that no human authority could control or manipulate. The chase up the ridge became a deadly game of cat and mouse among the granite boulders and stunted pines that marked the tree line above Dustwell. Governor Whitfield and his remaining guards had chosen their retreat route well. The rocky terrain provided excellent defensive positions, while channeling pursuit into predictable approaches, where superior firepower could compensate for inferior numbers. Silas followed, Cole Brennan's pursuit on foot, the cavalry saber strapped across his back and the brass compass secure in his pocket. Behind them, Colonel Thompson's legitimate federal forces had secured the trading post area and were beginning the methodical work of arresting the surviving corrupt operatives. But Whitfield's escape would mean the loss of the man who could provide testimony that reached into the highest levels of territorial and federal government. "Brennan!" Whitfield's voice echoed among the rocks as the first heavy raindrops began falling from the storm clouds that had been building all afternoon. "You're pursuing a territorial governor." "This is treason!" "You're not a governor anymore," Cole replied, using hand signals to coordinate his advance with his two remaining gang members. "You're a criminal fleeing federal custody." The exchange of gunfire resumed as Whitfield's guards attempted to hold their position while their employer continued climbing toward the ridge crest. But the approaching storm was changing the tactical situation rapidly. Visibility was decreasing, footing was becoming treacherous on the wet rocks, and the temperature was dropping toward freezing as evening approached. Silas worked his way around the northern flank of the pursuit, using skills learned during cavalry reconnaissance missions to approach the governor's position from an unexpected direction. The terrain reminded him of battlefields from the war, where individual courage and tactical thinking mattered more than superior numbers or equipment. As he climbed, memories surfaced of the young Confederate soldier he'd spared 23 years earlier, Lieutenant James Whitmore, who'd given him the brass compass that now seemed to burn with significance in his pocket. Had that act of mercy been genuine gratitude, or had it been the first move in a conspiracy that reached across decades? The question was answered when he reached a position overlooking Whitfield's defensive site and saw the governor clearly for the first time. Despite 20 years of aging and the effects of political power, the face was unmistakable. James Whitmore, the wounded Confederate soldier whose life Silas had saved, had become Marcus Whitfield, the corrupt territorial governor whose crimes had claimed 15 innocent lives. "Whitmore," Silas called out, his voice cutting through the sound of rain and gunfire. "Or do you prefer Whitfield these days?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. Whitfield's defensive fire stopped as he turned to locate the source of the voice that had used his real name. When he spotted Silas among the rocks above his position, his expression showed recognition mixed with something that might have been shame. "Ezra Whitmore," Whitfield said quietly. "I wondered when you'd remember. Hard to forget the man whose life you saved." Silas began working his way down toward Whitfield's position, the cavalry saber now in his hand. "Harder to understand how that man became a murderer and a thief. I became what survival required." Whitfield's guards maintained their defensive positions, but seemed uncertain whether their employer was negotiating or confessing. "The war destroyed everything I believed in. Family, honor, cause, all of it proved to be lies told by politicians who sent better men to die for their ambitions. So you decided to become one of those politicians. I decided to take control of my own fate instead of trusting others to determine it." Whitfield's voice carried the bitter certainty of a man who'd spent decades justifying increasingly terrible choices. "The territorial governorship gave me the power to prevent others from experiencing what I endured by murdering anyone who threatened your power, by eliminating threats before they could destroy what I'd built." Whitfield raised his weapon, but his hands shook with something that might have been age or emotion. Thomas Caldwell would have destroyed 20 years of careful work with his idealistic crusade for truth. The others died because they couldn't understand that some secrets serve the greater good. The confrontation had crystallized into something beyond politics or law. It was a reckoning between two men whose lives had been shaped by a moment of mercy during America's bloodiest war. One had used that mercy as inspiration for further compassion. The other had twisted it into justification for decades of cruelty. "James," Silas said, using the name from their first encounter, "that compass you gave me has been burning a hole in my pocket for 20 years. Time to find out what you really wanted me to do with it." "The cash," Whitfield whispered. "You found the cash. I found more than that. I found your real plan. Use me to locate the gold, then eliminate everyone who knew about it." Silas continued his careful advance down the rocky slope. "But you made one mistake, James. You assumed I was still the broken soldier you met in 1863, aren't you? No, I'm something much more dangerous, a man who's finally found something. worth fighting for. The final exchange came not with gunfire, but with the deadly whisper of steel as Silas's cavalry saber found its mark. Governor Marcus Whitfield died as Lieutenant James Whitmore, the frightened young soldier whose gratitude had become corrupted into decades of calculated evil. As Silas knelt beside the body, Cole Brennan and his surviving gang members reached the ridge crest. "It's over," Cole said quietly. "Thompson's people have secured everyone else." "Not quite over," Silas replied, withdrawing the brass compass from his pocket. "Still have a cache of stolen gold to return to its rightful owners." The storm was reaching full intensity now, with snow beginning to mix with the rain as temperature dropped toward winter levels. But for the first time in 23 years, Silas McCrae felt the peace that came from debts finally paid and honor finally restored. 6 months later, the mountain meadows around Dustwell bloomed with wildflowers that painted the landscape in colors that seemed too vivid for a place that had witnessed so much violence and corruption. The trading post had been transformed from a refuge for a broken outlaw into a home, where laughter echoed off the walls and the smell of Sarah's cooking drew neighbors for miles around. Silas stood on the porch watching Scout, Ranger, and Sentry play with a new litter of puppies that had arrived courtesy of a local rancher whose gratitude for Silas's help during a difficult calving season had taken four-legged form. The sight of the dogs teaching their offspring the same protective instincts that had served the family so well brought a smile to his weathered face. "Admiring your growing pack?" Sarah asked, joining him on the porch with 2 cups of coffee and the comfortable ease of a woman who'd found her place in the world. "Thinking about how much has changed since I first found 3 scared puppies by a burned wagon." Silas accepted the coffee and settled into the chair he'd built during the long winter months when snow had locked the high country in peaceful isolation. Hard to believe it's only been 9 months. The Confederate gold cache had been recovered exactly where the cipher and compass indicated, buried beneath a carefully camouflaged site near Devil's Canyon. The federal investigators had returned the funds to the territorial treasury, where they would be used for legitimate government purposes under the oversight of officials who'd been thoroughly vetted for corruption. Governor Whitfield's criminal network had been dismantled, with trials scheduled for the surviving conspirators who'd agreed to testify in exchange for reduced sentences. Cole Brennan had received a presidential pardon for his years of undercover work, though he'd chosen to remain in the territory rather than return to whatever life he'd left behind when he became an outlaw. His testimony had been crucial in convicting the surviving members of the corruption network, and his knowledge of territorial criminal activity had proven invaluable to legitimate law enforcement efforts. "Any word from Colonel Thompson about the trials?" Sarah asked, settling into her own chair with the fluid grace that spoke of contentment rather than mere comfort. "Last letter said the prosecutions are proceeding better than expected. Turns out once people started talking, the corruption reached further than anyone imagined." Silas sipped his coffee and watched Sentry demonstrate proper alertness techniques to an attentive puppy. "Justice moves slowly, but it does move." The territorial government had offered Silas a position as a federal marshal, recognizing that his unique combination of military training, outlaw experience, and proven integrity made him ideal for law enforcement in frontier conditions. He'd accepted the badge with the understanding that his jurisdiction would be limited to the areas around Dustwell, where he could protect the community that had become his family. "I've been thinking about Thomas's journal," Sarah said, her voice carrying the mix of sadness and peace that came from grief transformed into purpose. "About publishing it as a book so people understand what corruption costs and how ordinary citizens can fight back. Think folks would want to read about territorial politics? I think they'd want to read about how courage and principle can triumph over power and corruption. About how one person's decision to do the right thing can change everything." Sarah smiled and took his hand. "About how mercy toward 3 scared puppies led to justice for 15 murdered people." The afternoon passed in comfortable conversation about practical matters, the spring planting, repairs needed on the trading post's roof, and plans for expanding the small school that Dustwell's growing population required. Sarah had agreed to serve as the teacher, her education and Thomas's extensive library providing resources that frontier children rarely accessed. As evening approached, Silas found himself thinking about the letter he'd received from an unexpected source, Marcus McCrae, his estranged brother who'd somehow learned about the events that had transformed Silas from wanted outlaw to respected lawman. The letter had been brief, but carried genuine emotion that suggested family bonds could survive even decades of separation and shame. "Sarah," he said as they prepared for the evening routine of feeding animals and securing the property, "how would you feel about hosting a visitor this summer? Someone I haven't seen in 25 years. Your brother." Silas looked at her with surprise. "How did you know?" "Because you get the same expression when you talk about family that you get when you're trying to decide whether to trust someone with something important." Sarah stood and stretched, her movements carrying the easy confidence of a woman who'd found her strength through adversity. "I think it's time you stopped running from people who might love you despite your past." That evening, as they sat by the fire with the dogs arranged around them in protective formation, Silas reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from exile to redemption. The cavalry saber hung above the mantle now, no longer a symbol of lost honor, but a reminder that principles worth fighting for never truly died. They simply waited for the right moment to resurface. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Giving up the outlaw life for respectability?" "Never," Silas replied, watching Scout teach a puppy the importance of staying alert while maintaining calm. A man can spend 30 years running from who he used to be, but eventually he has to decide who he wants to become. Outside, the Montana wind carried the scents of wildflowers and fresh grass, the sounds of cattle lowing in distant pastures, and the promise of thunderstorms that would bring life-giving rain to the high country. Inside the trading post that had become a home, two people who'd found each other through shared adversity planned a future that honored the past while embracing hope. The brass compass sat on the mantle beside the cavalry saber, its purpose finally fulfilled after 23 years of waiting. But its true value had never been the Confederate gold it helped locate. It had been the reminder that acts of mercy, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, could echo across decades to reshape lives and restore faith in the possibility of justice. As the fire burned low and the dogs settled into sleep, Silas McCrae understood that sometimes the most important journeys ended not when a man reached his destination, but when he finally stopped running from the place he'd always belonged.